LDComics is a women-led welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeton as Ladies Do Comics, today LDComics is run by a committee of published graphic novelists: Rachel Ball, Emma Burleigh, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeton. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
Hi again to everyone, and thank you for joining in this comic dialogue and presentation. So as Emma mentioned, my name is Pix. I'm from Singapore, and when I'm not working on comics, I'm teaching art to kids. And so when I was preparing for this presentation, I thought I came across this photo of a cat that I took, and it's kind of capturing my general relationship I have or like kind of how I think about my comics is that I try to tell stories that are hidden in plain sight. Stories that maybe have been deemed somehow unimportant, or they have been made to stay invisible by some made up rules in society. And so in thinking about a story or a person's story, I often start to wonder about the context with which they are in, the situation, the environment that they come from. And I think particularly through the years in making comics, I started to notice that at least in more recent years, the past like 4 or 5 years, I've been thinking a lot more about my parents in particular, wondering about their beliefs, motivations, their dreams and behaviors, etc., etc. And just kind of, start to think of theories as to how they've come to be. Yeah. And so I'm just going to share a little bit like how I used to make comics. So this is way back 2006 to 2009 time period. The comics tended to be kind of just pen on paper. In talking about comics, I need to highlight that I grew up in a household where we have a very unhealthy practice of muting discomforts or denying very uncomfortable feelings. And I think that probably pushed me to take a lot of comfort in the act of journaling. And that grew to become comics. So words in particular, it's very important for me because I was brought up to stay very quiet in the house. So this is just an example of an early comic where it was made during a time where a very close family friend and uncle was dying from cancer. His name is Uncle Simon, that you can see in the last panel. And I remember making this during a time that, everyone in the house was just quiet about it. The one person that's most impacted by this event is my dad, because this was his childhood friend who was dying, and they've known each other for like a big proportion of their life, really. And I remembered that there was just this sense of nobody ask about how he's feeling in front of others. Maybe privately they do it to him. But I will never ever see my mom or my sister or ask about how he's doing with me as a witness to the questions. And this is quite like reflective to the way I was brought up, which is overall sadness or difficult to hold feelings are not to be shared communally. It's to be done privately, perhaps. And so I grew up with this idea that any sort of explicit expression of very, very hard to hold feelings are not to be shown. And so it just forces people to suffer in silence and develop shame out of it. And for me, that's very, very annoying because it's usually so far from the truth. It's usually everyone just suffering in silence individually. And after some time, you just realize everybody was struggling a lot. So I began to use comics to write out the words that I wished I could say in front of my family. So that's how it started. And eventually, I think after years of working on pen on paper, I wanted to experiment a little bit more on my medium. So I started working in inks that you can see in this slide. And then I started watercolors. And then I grew to acrylic paints. Honestly, the pieces I'm showing you, I'm not quite proud of them, but ultimately they're just part of the journey. So it's just wanted to share that. I started to land on acrylic paints in particular because it's quite it's a pretty manageable medium, even though it's wet. And then I think at some point I applied for an artist residency to kind of give myself a proper time and space to focus in experimenting in acrylic paint, in a way get back to it, because that was kind of what I was doing a little bit in art college as well. But this time with the intention to kind of merge comics and paintings together and see what happens. So I think it was during this residency where, I'm just figuring out practical things like what kind of handwriting do I want for my comics? Like, do I want to do cursive? Do I want non-cursive? Because I kind of write in both in different, differently. I would wonder what kind of tools do I want to use to write the words? Do I want to use pen? Do I want to go back to marker and pen, or do I want to use paint? And so artist residencies are generally, I find, very helpful once you kind of remove the like the daily things you have to do and just put your mind and focus into a particular into your art practice, really. And I think as I started making comics from 2006, by around this point of time, I've had enough work that I could sort of pitch as an idea to Drawn and Quarterly to publish. And thankfully, they did it in sweet time. But oddly enough, it was published during the pandemic year of 2020. But still grateful that it happened. And these are some of the pieces inside the first book, Sweet Time. Oh, and this was made during lockdown. Again, it's kind of like getting back into journaling when times get a little confusing. These are some pieces from the diaries made during the lockdown here in Singapore, which was pretty much April and May of, I think it got extended. So we had April, May, June, July, where we had lockdown here. And I think by late 2018, I started to work on Let's Not Talk Anymore. A book also published by Drawn and Quarterly in 2021. Before Let's Not Talk Anymore, I've just been, the previous stuff you see, they're mostly short comics they're short stories in a way, but I kind of wanted to get into the realm of long comics, such as a story starts, like a story from the beginning to the end. It could be about 150 pages and more. But it's something new to me. So I decided I wanted to break it down into manageable pieces that would be less intimidating, and yet have a format that still work for the story that I was wanting to tell, which is I wanted to work on a story inspired by figures along my matrilineal line. And in particular, I wanted to show how trauma can be hereditary. In this one, you see it's my great-grandmother in the field. It's a work of fiction and non-fiction. So there's a lot of stories from my maternal side that I don't know of. And then there's a lot of imagination that has to happen based on that. Based on like little things that I hear as a kid. But generally that side of the family, there isn't much stories that's being passed along. There isn't a practice of doing that. It's kind of why I wanted to work on the graphic novel, because the stories seem to be hidden or lost. Oh, I realize you can't see my mouse moving. I'm trying to point at a particular character. But okay, anyway, this would be my maternal grandmother's story. This would be my mom's story. At some point, her dad left the house. So the last panel shows him missing. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Cei Douglas, like Emma said. As you can see, this is supposed to be a picture of me, just about, but slightly more accurately my dog, Kira. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about silent narrative and anxious thoughts, and a bit about the process behind my book, All the Places in Between, which is published by Liminal 11. Okay. So I've suffered from mental health problems for over half my life. I was diagnosed as agoraphobic, didn't leave the house for a long time, suffered severe anxiety, depression, and chronic fatigue. And they're the kind of things that never really go away, as they like to increasingly remind me. So yeah, I found for me, it's more about how you manage them day to day. And so for anyone not familiar with my work, these are some of my previous comics, which touch on themes of relationships and mental health, and where I really explore the kind of mental health issues I mentioned before, and where I really started to explore silent comics as a method to explore these kind of feelings of anxiety and depression, and develop my own kind of visual language for them, with a lot of recurring themes I come back to often, like being lost, struggling underwater, or just overwhelming thoughts, and also sometimes just badgers wrestling tigers for no reason. It's all culminated in putting together my first full-length book. Honestly, I was pleasantly surprised that I actually managed to make something this long. It's taken me quite a long time to get here, and I'm really pleased to be able to share this with you at all, because it's not something I always thought I'd actually be able to do. And so this is where it started. The very first initial sketch I did for the project, which really became something different later on. I made this as part of an application for a comic residency in Finland. Conceptually, it was still quite a similar idea, but it sort of took on a life of its own when I got to work on it later. I never got to go to Finland, but I put this idea aside, and years later I came back to it because of another Finnish artist, which is Tuve Jansson. I basically got really inspired at the exhibition at Dulwich Picture Gallery that she had with lots of the work from the movements, the really small ink drawings, which were all really intricate and precise, and just gave this feeling of this sort of world that you wanted to inhabit and be part of. And I really like black and white art like this, and it made me feel better about wanting to make it myself. And so I kind of took this as a starting point, and it got me thinking about that idea again in a really new and exciting way to me. So this spread from my Badger versus Tiger comic, which proved to be kind of a key in the process of visualizing all the places, and made me realize it wasn't quite as throwaway as I first thought. So I drew this spread smaller than the rest of the Badger comic, and it kind of has the Badger having an existential crisis and a kind of anxiety dream feeling, which is the kind of thing I really wanted to expand on. And I also realized I'd already made an entire silent story and basically figured out the kind of art style I wanted to use throughout the project without really knowing it. And I felt it was the best way to emphasize this kind of light style for this kind of subject, because it gives the reader an easy way in. And with kind of unassuming, delicate lines, it leaves the rest up to you and doesn't overwhelm you too much, and leaves room for you to explore. So of course, early on, and inspired by the movements, I thought my main character should be a badger. Luckily, this didn't last too long, and I quickly kind of changed my mind on that. It didn't have the right feeling at all. My main character is probably subconsciously inspired by Tuve, and also just the memory I had of how she drew herself as a character in Moomin Valley in November, which really had the kind of balance and feeling I was looking for. This is the first page that I drew, and it's a different format at this point, and it changed to become square later because it had a better balance and gave a kind of more rigid set of rules to play around with and then break whenever you wanted to. I find silent comics to be a really amazing medium to tell stories about these kind of feelings and thoughts, because I think you can get a great sense of what's behind them. And I want people to interact with the story themselves and take what they want from it, rather than just me telling the story of my experience with mental health in a linear way. I wanted to give an impression of how these kind of things feel in the moment, and the experience of struggling and not always quite knowing where to turn. Like helping people to explore their own feelings or get some comfort from it, kind of like listening to an album or something that people can just pick up and look at from time to time to think on things. In the process of making the comic, I tried to keep things really simple, drawing everything by hand and using as few things as possible, which I think was really important to keep things consistent for me and also make a longer work than before. It just gave me a lot less to think about. So there's only one pencil there, one dip pen. I use a brush pen to fill things in, and just a couple of fine liners to neaten things up. And then a lot of white ink for all my corrections. And then the ink wash is just done by hand, and then I add it in Photoshop afterwards so I can kind of clip it in really neatly. It just makes things a little bit easier. So I broke everything up into little chapters. Similar to what Pick said in the first time I did a longer comic, it really helped to just break things into pieces and work on it a bit at a time. They chopped and changed as I went along, just doing one thing at a time. It used to be 12 chapters, but it was 10 at the end. And I used this little piece of paper on the right to basically keep track of everything the whole way through. And it was only supposed to be 100 pages, but the story kept expanding and kind of demanding more space. So I tried to just do what it told me to. And I would work on rough layouts of about 12 or 20 pages at a time so I could get the right balance for things and keep working like that section by section. I'd probably lay the same part out maybe 4 or 5 times until it had the right feel, because I find it's especially important with silent comics. It's about the balance and the composition of the layouts. So I try and plan these as much as possible. There's no script or words to dictate the panels or the sizes, so it's all based more on feeling, and it's quite intuitive. It also lets you plan the overall structure in advance and kind of see how things map out and time things and do everything in a more visual way and kind of time the beats of everything like nicely. And yeah, it kind of gives a bit more freedom because you're not, whenever I put words in comics, I have to take half of them out because I don't have space. So I find it a more free way to work sometimes. So during the process of making the comic, there's a lot of music that really inspired me. And it was especially early Sonic Youth and the Cocteau Twins, and a lot of the stuff I was listening to in art college in like 2000, yeah, the year 2000, that's sad. And I was reading Kim Gordon's autobiography, and she was like a big influence in my head throughout the whole thing. And it kind of became a soundtrack for large parts of the book. And yeah, these two bands were really important. A lot of the time I'm listening to the music and it's just how I want the book to feel, kind of dreamy soundscapes or stop-start moments of high energy and anxiety. And I really appreciate all the kind of loops and refrains in their work and that feeling of getting lost, which is something I really wanted to emphasize in the book. And yeah, I also had Wu-Tang Forever on from start to finish quite a lot throughout too, just for balance. This tsunami section was also a really key one for me in trying to put across this feeling of becoming overwhelmed and that kind of anxious sensation of dread and how it totally envelops you. I mean, it's really quite literal, but it's really just a giant wave of anxiety, but also this moment where you see it coming and you know it's going to hit you, but you also can't do anything about it. I'd had this idea to put in a book for a while, and it was always going to be a long, tall page. But it completely changed and became a pivotal moment in this story, with the first half of the book kind of building towards it, and then the second half, the fallout from after that. I think it was the hardest and most complicated and longest sequence for me to make, but I'm really happy how it came out. And I think they're some of my favorite pages now, especially the sort of disconnect I have between two parts, which it goes on for about 6 pages. And yeah, I hope that resonates with people in the same sort of way. The other big inspirations I had when working on the book were David Lynch films and Talking Heads, which all happened around the same time for me, which was around, I think it was around autumn 2020, and I was kind of getting into the last third of the book, and Stop Making Sense was a really key thing for me in sort of how I started enjoying David Lynch's films as well. Like just literally taking that title at face value in a way. When I was younger, I tried and force David Lynch films to sort of make a logical sense instead of enjoying them as and how they are. And I then tried to apply this to my own work in just trying to capture the right feelings and then letting the rest follow. I'm really inspired by both, but especially how David Lynch thinks of ideas and how your job is to sort of nurture them and express them as best you can to your audience. And I was really happy to get to do that in this project, and I think I managed to actually do that well for once and kind of let them do the work and just try to make the right decisions that serve the story along the way. And this shot of the mirror in Mulholland Drive kind of leads me to I was very keen to have a lot of mirror images and loops and refrains through the story, because it was my feeling they'd engage people on another level, to give the story this feeling of cycles and ways of thinking and feelings, kind of like waves of emotion and little things that loop around or coming back, or musical refrains, like I said before. I consciously put in as many as I could throughout the book, when they came up, because it really felt like a good way to express how these kind of cycles of thinking work. Returning to the same thoughts or the same places with slightly different contexts or insight than you had the last time, but they kind of maintain this presence throughout. It's one of the things I felt most satisfied with in the story, a kind of planned, unplanned thing that came naturally as it went along. And yeah, it's also just one I was really hoping people would notice. And a lot of it, in the end, calls back to the beginning of the book, but it has a different kind of context there. This has more of a sense of wonder and peace, and I always try to give a balance between positive and negative, although often the negative can draw me a little more strongly. So I like to have these fleeting moments, at least before the next wave comes along and sort of washes everything away. And yeah, so if anyone has questions, please, Kira's here for you.
Hey everyone, hopefully everyone has come back and no one has left since John's talk, but even if you have, it's okay, don't worry. I'm sure we can watch the recordings as well. You know, the problem with being the last one is that each time Pix, so after Pix, I was like brain explosion, like so many connections with my own work, and I was like, oh my God, I can see so many parallels. And then the same thing happened with John's presentation. And so now I'm like, I just want to like connect my work to their work, but that's obviously not what I had prepared. So I feel like my brain is going through a little meltdown, and I might just try to do like weave it in as I'm going along, but let's see how that goes. But anyway, my presentation is going to focus on my book. So I actually did a presentation before for Ladies Do Comics, and it was with Wallace in February. Wallace, do you remember? It was just before COVID actually hit. It was pretty a hit in the UK at least. It was probably like spreading elsewhere in other parts of the world, but we were in the Cartoon Museum. It was real life, it was in person, and it was just before everything kicked off. And for me, it was such, at that point as well, I had loads of components of my book, but I hadn't really, it wasn't really in the final stages at all, and I was actually really anxious about presenting it to the group. So it feels nice right now. It feels like almost like a full circle, coming back to you all and sharing the book as a complete form and just reflecting on some of my intentions. So I think that's what I'm going to do for this presentation. So it's called The Roles We Play, and it's out with Myriad. This is how I start it off. So it starts off quite tender. I'm looking at myself in the mirror and I'm asking myself, how do I start this? And I found a tweet by an American kind of like tech guru. She's not really a tech guru. She's worked for big tech companies, but she's quite, you know, she really sort of, her tweets are interesting. Her platform is very critical and analytical of everything. She's East Asian, and her tweet here pretty much summed up my intentions as well. So I'll just read it out. My parents were tasked with the job of survival, and I with self-actualization. The immigrant generational gap is real. What a luxury it is to search for purpose, meaning, and fulfillment. So I think that really runs across in all of my work and all of my line of inquiry in the book. And before I dive in, I wanted to share this picture of myself back in 1994. It's like printed in person, and I just find it absolutely hilarious that, you know, gosh, how many, 20 years on, I am doing very similar things to what I was doing back when 9-year-old Sabba was looking at herself in the mirror. So that's quite interesting. So anyway, I get loads of people ask me like what the drive for my book was, and I think for me one of the biggest sorry, I also forgot to time myself. Okay, so maybe 20 minutes. One of the key underlying drivers for me was about giving a cultural voice to a large minority group that, in my experience, does not often make it into literature and the arts. And that is a specific part of the Pakistani UK diaspora. A lot of people don't, unless you're from the diaspora, people that are not part of the diaspora won't really know of it unless they're other South Asians and they're just familiar with the history. But for me, it was completely mind-blowing how we're a huge part of colonial history and just contemporary history as well, in terms of the amount of South Asian culture that sort of transpires in the UK, that we're not having those specific conversations about migration histories and how we're all, you know, like, I guess the reasoning behind why certain communities exist in the way that they do in the UK. So for me, that was a huge driver for me. And the fact that that wasn't being shown in literature or the arts, you know, I'd be picking up South Asian books and consuming a lot of the cultural arts, but not really seeing a lot of my own experiences mirrored into that. And I guess for me, what I put that down to was a sort of internal class issue. Perhaps it's because a lot of the diaspora that make it to, you know, that have access to either further resources or educational background that allows them to then go on to produce books and produce film and theatre. Perhaps they're just from a less of a working class, I guess, diaspora. I feel like I'm babbling, so I'm just going to read this little bit that's on the bottom left here. It's a conversation that ends up really happening quite a lot for a lot of people that are within the Mirbury community, the Azad Kashmiri diaspora. So when asked, where are you from? We simply say, we're from Pakistan, really to avoid recounting the history of partition, the conflict of Kashmir, the water treaty, the dam, the migration. And even if we did call ourselves Kashmiri, would it be Kashmiri or Azad, free Kashmiri, itself a loaded, politicized question? So I then go on and ask, what is a displaced person? A person who is forced to leave their home. Oh, I can't read that because of the screen share, never mind. What is a diaspora? The movement, migration, or scattering of a people away from an established or ancestral home. So I feel like throughout the book, I'm asking these really kind of deep philosophical questions, also quite simple questions. A lot of it was to help me understand the situation and help me detangle and demystify just, I guess, the fact that a lot of these topics weren't being spoken about, even with firstly from within the community, but also when I'd go beyond and go to university backgrounds or go to other South Asian events. There wasn't that sort of conversation where it's just like, okay, let's unpack and understand this. Oops. Sorry. And so you see that really coming to light now that the book is in the flesh, it's in the bookstores. Just the other day, on my Instagram feed, I was alerted to the fact that a bookstagrammer, who's a South Asian bookstagrammer, was looking for literature that was specific to the Mirpur area. So Mirpur is the city, Azad Kashmir is under Pakistan. So there's like terminology issues as well, where when you say Pakistan, when you say Pakistan, it's an umbrella term. But what I'm talking about is actually specific to the Azad Kashmiri community, which is actually part of the there's the Indian conflict, and then there's the Pakistan side, which is being administered by Pakistan. And even within that, just when I'm talking about it, I feel like I end up confusing myself about it. So anyway, this person was like, hey, is there any literature out there that's specific to our diaspora? And lo and behold, there was a whole bunch of people that got back to them, and my book was mentioned 4 times, which was really exciting for me, because I was just like, people are knowing about this, and the fact that I'm like alerting everyone to the fact that this needs to be spoken about. But also it was also sad at the same time, because it showed that there isn't enough of that. And sorry, I actually just realized that I missed one of the key components, because I was actually quite nervous. I'm getting over my nerves now. So just going back to this map here, so 2% of England's population is Pakistani. That's the Pakistani diaspora. And out of that 2%, 2/3 are actually connected to the Mirbari story, the Azad Kashmiri story. And so suddenly you find there's a minority, but within the minority there is a big majority that really dictates what the culture looks like, and how we identify ourselves. But in a way, there's a bit of a self-erasure because of the fact that we're under this umbrella term and we don't talk about it. There's a whole lot of shame that's connected to it, and a lot of erasure. So hopefully that goes to explaining a little bit of it. That was really bad explanation. Anyway, never mind. Also, the brown hijabi picks up on it as well, where when she shared the book, she said, I never expected to see the building of the Mangla Dam in a graphic novel. I love how Sabba tells her personal story with such honouring of the colonial and complex histories we all have inherited. And then here's an excerpt from the Eastern Eye, where that was also highlighting the Mirbari experience, my experience, but also the wider Mirbari story. So it's a big thing to start talking about it, I think, and to honour that story, and to really give it a visual language, give it a literary language, give it a poetic language as well, really sort of just I think the pages in the book allowed me to both explore it and discover it for myself, but also to celebrate it for my family as well. And I think that's something, all of those things had not happened in my lifetime, at least. And I think with my family, my mum and dad being the first generation that came over, I don't think they had the space to move beyond just surviving here in the UK, to be able to really reflect on what they had experienced and what their parents had experienced. So going back to Bo Wren's tweet at the beginning, it was really like an honor and a privilege to be able to like use this book as a vehicle to do that. So yeah, a big part of that sort of background canvas for the book and my own experiences is the story of the migration, the legacy of empire, and retelling history through a female perspective. So that's something that I really picked up on with Pix's matrilineal storytelling as well. I used my mum as a vehicle for telling those stories and explaining what had happened and what she and her family went through when the dam was being built, but also when they migrated, how they tried to settle in, and some of those experiences. So these are some of the drawings from that. I can see chats happening, but I can't actually see them, so I'm gonna have to see them at the end. And these are some more drawings. I'm also showing some of the reference images that I used. I've only ever been to Pakistan 3 times in my life. The last time I went, I was 18 years old. And for me, the internet, YouTube, there's some person who's got a drone that lives out there and takes loads of random drone videos of the dam when it's in low tide and high tide and different seasons. And that was really useful to get an idea of the geography, but also Facebook groups as well. That there's one really key Facebook group, and they tend to have like black and white shots, and then they'll color them. They'll use this like digital service that allows them to color it. And there's a whole bunch of those that really helped me paint this picture of the time before the dam was built, that my mum saw when she was very young, and then the time after the dam, and the ripple on effect of that construction, the construction of the dam, what that meant for the people that lived there, and how that triggered the mass, the migration to the UK in the 60s and 70s. And I think I've not really explained it so well here, but my family, when they talk about the dam, it's very much specific to, I've only got a couple of minutes left, haven't I, Emma? 5 minutes, okay. I feel like I did this in the practice one where I spent loads of time explaining the like history of it and not the other stuff. But I'll go on. So yeah, this is a panel that looks at what my mum and her dad, my granddad, went through once the dam had been built. They had to be relocated to an area nearby, and they had to re-irrigate it themselves. So there was this beautiful moment when she was telling me these stories. She said, what a river would do over hundreds of years of slow erosion, we did with our bare hands. So they had to move and irrigate the land in a way that was wholly unnatural to it, and that they had to do that because the fertile land was the lowland. The lowland was where the dam had subsumed all those villages and all the agricultural land. Yeah, so that's the backdrop, and that's what frames the more specific relationship orientated memories and stories within the book. So there's photos of me and my mum and me and my dad and my wider family structure, and really it's a love song to them. So I'm going to read this bit. My mother, my home, the home they tell me to go back to, like strawberries we grow, offshoots of each other. So it was really important for me to celebrate the fact that we're a wider extended family, and the support networks that we'd created between each other as a survival mechanism, as a response to sort of migration and the racism of 60s and 70s UK and London. Here's some old photos of 90s East London and how I start to weave that into the storytelling. Here's some of the meals that we used to have, the extended family. Family is not nuclear, it is collective and communal. There is no self here, no individual. If we all take care of each other, then no one has to take care of themselves alone. And that was really the philosophy that my family lived by. And yeah, it was really important to pick that out for myself, like the things that are often lost in and amongst a lot of the sort of negative stereotyping, or the sort of internalized stuff that we carry with us. And so the book for me was a space to sort of clear the fog and try to hold on to some of those beautiful aspects of I guess what gives us that resilience and that strength to keep going. And then one of those figures again is my uncle. So there's a whole chapter where I really celebrate his role in my life as well. I think it's something that Bell Hooks said in It's All About Love, where migrant families and often migrant extended families, the different members of the family would show you love in different ways. And so the focus and the responsibility didn't lie solely on the parent figures. and you'd get to see different types of love. And I really, channeling bell hooks, identified my uncle as the secondary father figure in my life. And so there's a whole bit on him as well. So going from like geopolitics and like big landscapes and infrastructural projects in history, I make space for my own experiences as well, because it's not only an honouring for my family and for our history, but also an honouring of my own experiences. So it was really important for me to make tangible those reflective thoughts, that little girl in the mirror, and the thoughts that I've had, across so many different things. So it can get quite intense in the book, but there's also moments of therapy in there as well. I saw a holistic osteopath at one point in my healing journey, and we spoke a lot about breathing and how the way you breathe often reflects the anxiety that you've gone through, or the stresses that you carry, the emotional stresses. So it might not just be a physical manifestation, but an emotional, spiritual, psychological manifestation that happens in your body. So a lot of that gets channeled in there as well. Okay, I'm just going to quickly whiz through this. I'll talk about this. It was also really important for me to push beyond traditional or predictable narratives as well. So for most of my childhood life, I was visibly Muslim until my mid-20s when I wasn't. And it actually took a lot of effort for me to not make this book about that, both on a personal level, but also when it came to explaining it as well. So I have this like 2-page chapter in the book that I think for me is like my favorite chapter in the book, but at the moment it's my favorite chapter. Often it changes, but I'll just quickly read it. So from the left: sometimes I still dream with it on my scarf. I can feel it around my face, hugging my ears, a warmth, a comfort, but it's off. And now that eye contact, that silent, heartfelt solidarity with other hijabis is no longer there, no longer of their kin, no longer their sister, just another person in this cold place. And so, yeah, it was important for me to not just stop at the idea that, okay, now, I'm now no longer visibly Muslim and I'm going to adopt all of the Western notions of freedom and liberation and hedonistic lifestyle and all that sort of stuff. So it was important to move beyond that and not focus on that. So yeah, these are just some of the beautiful reviews I've had, just reminding myself that it's it's just really incredible to see the reaction that it's getting. I thought I'd put this in as well. I see that Liz is in the crowd. Hopefully she's still there. But it's also going to get published in the US as well. We've given it a new title and a new cover. So it's going to be called What is Home Mum in the US. So you'll start seeing that too. And this is just a thought that I had coming out of Thought Bubble that I found really interesting. So I've been pushing my book to a lot of South Asian readers just because it was just really, I kind of like, I knew that the graphic novel scene would read it because it's a graphic novel, but I really wanted to push it to non-graphic novel readerships and see how it would connect to people that on a thematic level, were like similar to my own experience. And I found that a lot of people actually struggled to articulate the response, like what they felt was really powerful and incredible. And they'd often come to me and be like, oh my gosh, that was incredible. But they would struggle to find the words. And I think I've like sussed it out coming out of Thought Bubble. I had a few conversations with Hannah Berry and Gabby from the Graphic Novel Reading Room, and Jenny Robbins as well. And so I think I'm just going to leave the statement here. So I think it's because graphic novels are not just a book. They are, much like films, an experience. They transport you, take over you. They are quick to consume, but potent. So I invite you to my experience. And I think that sort of nods back to John's reference to music and to film as well. I also have a playlist in my book as well, and I think for me a lot of it was about making it immersive and making it, yeah, just multisensory.